Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Will.
How are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me on to talk about the book.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for coming on, Free Will. And for those of you in Blogging Heads land, I'm Will Wilkinson at the Cato Institute, and with me today is author Jeff Sharlet, who's got a new book coming out imminently. It's called The Family, The Secret Fundamentalism at the Heart of American Power. It sounds very spooky, Jeff.
I think that's a good thing. Spooky might make people pay attention, at least, to start with.
That's right. Now, I wasn't familiar with The Family at all, so I guess the place to start is to explain briefly what The Family, I also called The Fellowship, is, because it was a completely new thing to me and somewhat mysterious.
Yeah, The Family is actually one of the oldest and most enduring Christian conservative political organizations in the country. It goes back to 1935. And what it is a network of exclusively elite Christian activists and government, military, and business. They operate on the premise that they believe that Christianity got things wrong when it focused on the down and out, and that what really they need to do is focus on what they call the up and out. And if they can win what they call key men for Christ, then those people will implement God's law throughout society, and it doesn't really matter whether you or me are Christians. So they've been doing this for about 70 years, and nobody's really heard about them because since 1966 they decided that they would be most effective if they were, in their own words, invisible. Mm-hmm. It's not a conspiracy. It's just a very low profile group that does only one public event a year called the National Prayer Breakfast, and the rest of the time stays out of the way. And the prayer breakfast they consider a very small part of their international work. Yeah,
that's about the only thing I think I've ever heard of was the prayer breakfast. Now you say it's a network of people and not a conspiracy. So what exactly? So it's not really like an organization. It doesn't have a formal set of institutions. Can you explain a little bit more about what the structure is and what kind of people are involved?
It's a really interesting thing. They began in 1935 when it was an organization of Christian conservative anti-New Deal businessmen who felt that the Great Depression was God's punishment for FDR's programs. And at that time, they were fairly well organized. They were called something called International Christian, or they became called International Christian Leadership. But then, as the years went by, and I think as more and more as establishment power came to be challenged, they moved toward a looser structure. And they're part of a whole 20th century movement of men, and it's a very male-oriented movement, challenging the structures of the church. So their lack of visible organization is as much a sign of their frustration with what they see as a too effeminate church. They want a more muscular Christ, and they just want men getting together in these meetings. And so when they say it's a network, that's why they use the term the family. They consider themselves a family, and if you're a member of the family, you are involved at a certain level. If you're a friend, it's a certain level sort of further out. But beyond all that, in fact, there is a structure. One of the puzzling things is I've written about them for Harper's, and the LA Times did an investigative report, NBC did an investigative report, and every time a news organization goes to talk to them, their first response is, well, there's no organization here. We're just a group of friends. Mm-hmm. And, the reporter's response, mine, the LA Times, NBC's, is always, well, what about these tax records? And then they acknowledge that, yeah, there's an organization, and that there's, in fact, literally a network of nonprofits, the Fellowship Foundation, the International Foundation, many others that are sort of interlocking. And that beyond that, and their documents, and I spent literally years sort of looking through their documents that they stored at the Billy Graham Center archives, you see that they're dedicated to moving money around very literally off the books. If you want to donate money, you don't give money to the Fellowship Foundation. You go and you talk to them, and they say, why don't you help out so-and-so and give him just a gift as a friend. Mm-hmm. So that's what they mean by a network. And I always sort of go out of my way to defend them because I don't want this misunderstood as a conspiracy. The reason they do that, even though they use ridiculous terms, they like to joke about themselves as a Christian mafia, is they think that they are resisting the institutionalization of the church. Of course, those of us on the outside are going to say you're also resisting the accountability of the church. They're not acting like a good evangelical organization that signs up with one of the monitoring agencies that does accountability and make sure the money is being spent the way it's supposed to be, make sure people are doing what they're saying they're doing. You can't do that with a group that says that it doesn't exist.
Yeah. So this group, though, it's not just, like striving middle managers at, medium-sized corporations. It involves real wheeler dealers, real sort of rainmakers and power players in Washington. So can you name a few of the people who are sort of intimately tied to the family?
Sure. Well, when I first got involved, I moved in with the group for a month, and I didn't know that there was anything political. And the first day I'm there, they said, "Oh, Jesse Helms is coming by for a visit." And at the time, I thought it was just a group of guys living together in a group home in Washington. That's an unusual visitor. And then a few days later, Ed Meese, a former attorney general who's still very much a wheeler and dealer in Washington, a guy who, was one of the deal brokers for the Roberts and Alito nominations. Ed Meese turns out to be hosting a weekly meeting for them of top businessmen.
Yeah, every now and then Ed Meese comes by.
Ed Meese, most people have that experience. Yeah. And Meese just pops in, for a nightcap or something like this. And then it turns out they have a house on C Street in Washington where they provide below-market housing for 6 to 8 congressmen who want to sort of live in this sort of closer spiritual counseling with the group. There I met Senator John Ensign of Nevada, and over time got to spend a lot of time with Senator Sam Brownback of Kansas, who's a member, Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma, Tom Coburn of Oklahoma, Congressman Joe Pitts of Pennsylvania, little known, but in fact the head of the House Values Action Team, which is this sort of off-the-record religious right caucus.
The Values Action Team.
Values Action Team, created by Tom DeLay, a man noted for his values. There's a Senate Values Action Team and a House Values Action Team. Sam Brownback runs the Senate.
It's not your values, I guess, or...
Well, no, it's not my values. You always look for the common ground, but it gets kind of scarce.
That's right.
Around there. There's a sort of an interesting thing of, can we do these things? They're not terribly interested in democracy, and that's not me accusing them of that. That's their papers from the very beginning. What they call democracy, they had a phrase, the din of vox populi. The idea is that God will choose people according to, this is their biblical scripture that they use, Romans 13, the powers that be are ordained of God. God will choose his leaders, and then God will reveal to those leaders special truths, and they can rule from above beyond the din of the vox populi. And if you can get these guys together in this network, they can really make the decisions that the people need, because you and I, Will, are not really capable of determining for ourselves what we need.
Probably true, but let's get back to. I want to get back to this idea of sort of being chosen and just being an instrument of God's will in a little bit, because I think there's something quite interesting there. But let's talk a little bit more about your experience in this house in Arlington. It was called Ivanwald?
Ivanwald, yeah.
Yeah. So how did you learn about? So a good part of the book, it's not just investigative reporting about this loose network of political power players. It's largely a personal account of your interaction with a lot of these people and the process by which you discover the truth about the family. So how did you get wrapped up in it in the first place?
Yeah. I mean, it begins almost as a memoir. At the time, this was back in 2001, I was working on my first book, for which I was traveling around the country, visiting unusual religious communities. A co-author and I were sort of looking at margins of faith. And at the time, a friend said that her brother, she was worried that he'd joined a cult. He had sort of quit a very promising career in finance. He had left a relationship that was, headed toward marriage. He was his late 20s, maybe 30, I can't remember, and he'd moved to Washington, just outside of Washington, D.C., to this house called Ivanwald. Well, he came up to New York, and since she knew that I wrote a lot about religion, she said, would you take this fellow, who I call Zeke in the book, because I use all real names except for this fellow, because I do want to protect him. He's a family friend. And he's not involved in the political part of it.
Yeah.
And, the interesting thing about Zeke was a much improved human being from the guy I'd known for 12 years. He'd always been just a real schmuck. First thing he does is he apologizes for all his anti-Semitic jokes over the year. I'm Jewish. He'd always been an anti-Semite, and I just had to bear him because I was friends with the family. And he says he's gotten involved in this thing, and that I should come and check it out. And I said, Zeke, I'm Jewish. And he says, well, I think you'll be interested. I know you write about religion. I know you think about religion. And we're not even Christians. Which is an odd thing, because he'd also allow that the word fundamentalist would apply to what they're doing.
Yeah.
But he didn't like the word Christian. So he invited me to come and live in this house, and because that's how I work as a writer. I'm not so much an investigative reporter as, well, I'll go and spend time with them. I moved in with these guys. I became a brother of the family, which I believe, as I understand it, I remain to this day, because they're Calvinists. You know, I've been chosen. I'm chosen for good. They knew I was Jewish. I went under my own name, but I think they're so used to not being challenged that they never really sort of became suspicious. And so I would just go with them, and we'd spend time doing a little Bible study and hanging out and playing sports and just being together and being groomed for leadership in the family. We'd have sessions with congressmen who would come and mentor us. And what really struck me, when I mentioned Jesse Helms came the first day. The other guy who came the first day was the Prime Minister of Norway. I thought that was such an unusual combination. I said, now this is a story. You know, Jesse Helms, old news, but Norway, you know.
Who knew?
And it clued me in that this was a different kind of religious conservatism that I think we're accustomed to seeing. You know, this was not the Jerry Falwell stuff. This was not Pat Robertson, that kind of, you know, populist televangelism. This was a very sophisticated internationalist, you know, group. And so I started paying more attention. And then as they started using the leadership lessons of Hitler, which was a fairly regular thing, at that point I said, this group has got some problems. And I would say, you know, guys, don't you have a problem with Hitler? And they would say, well, it's not his ends we admire, it's his means. And
which means do they have in mind? It's not like the innovative use of, you know, railroad cars that they have in mind.
No.
So which means do they have in mind? Just a certain kind of the sheer assertion of political will, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. The leader of the group is a man named Doug Coe, and you know, the first time I heard this, actually, I was sitting in on a spiritual counseling session he was having at their C Street house with Congressman Todd Tiahrt of Kansas. And Todd Tiahrt was going on about all the usual religious right issues, and Doug Coe was kind of humoring him. And finally said, look, you know, that's fine, that's all fine, but what we're talking about here is something much bigger than, you know, just abortion issues or parent school issues or you know, those kinds of hot-button issues. We're talking about a Christ of absolute power, a Christ who's not just on those issues, but what does Christ have to tell us about Social Security? What does Christ have to tell us about building roads? And what he's talking about is a Christ that you turn to for all decisions at every level of society. And then he gives his examples of other leaders who've done that. Hitler, Lenin, Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao. Hitler, Stalin, and Mao are the trinity that he mentions most often, and he's been doing this for years and years. And he'll say, now these are evil men. We don't admire them. But what those guys understood the New Testament better than any other leader in the 20th century. They understood that the New Testament calls for strong men. These guys who call for absolute totalitarian commitment. And that's the model that he reads Scripture as calling us toward.
That just seems weird.
It is weird.
So, is this based on some kind of reading of the Bible? I mean, like, so there's definitely, you know, part of Jesus' teaching is about the kingdom of God. That's definitely there. But what about all the stuff about humility and about orientation towards the suffering of the poor and, you know, rich men in the eyes of needles and things like that? Where did that go?
Yeah, that got lost, didn't it? Well, I mean, the group originally began not with Bible reading, but with visions. The founder of the group, back in 1935, Abraham Verady, had a series of visions that revealed to him that organized labor, and particularly a San Francisco organizer named Harry Bridges, who's pretty famous as leading probably the most successful strike in American history, were part of a satanic communist conspiracy. And he claims that God literally spoke to him in the middle of the night and told him this. And so
it really has like prophetic foundations rather than being based in any kind of text.
Exactly. They're very resistant to any kind of. They don't like theology. They don't like the church. They don't like all that stuff. They say, look, God will reveal to you the special message. One of the things that they like to emphasize is they say, look, the way that Christ works is on a concentric rings of power. And you can see that modeled in the Bible. And here I'm just sort of paraphrasing their way of thinking. They'll say James and Peter are closest to Christ, and so to them, he gives one set of teachings. And then you move out a little bit further, and there's the 12, and then there's the 70, and then there's the masses. Mm-hmm. So it is in the world. Some of us are close enough. Doug Coe is at the heart of that. Doug Coe gets these special teachings, and what these special teachings reveal to them. You asked about the suffering of the poor and all the wonderful things that are in the New Testament. They do believe in those things, but they believe in them as in a kind of trickle-down fundamentalism. The original insight was that if we can put God-led men in charge, then they will look after the poor. The poor don't need to look after themselves. In fact, the most important teaching of the New Testament, they think, is obedience. Mm-hmm. And, that's a very unorthodox... It's a very unorthodox theology, and unorthodox enough that there's a number of actually Christian conservatives who are just as uneasy with this group as the most wild-eyed leftist secularists.
It seems like there'd be sort of obvious sort of problems. Even if you're a believing Christian, like how. So there's this idea about obedience, right? And again in the book you point to people just in the prayers in the family. It's about people Jesus, just use me, make me your instrument. But how does an individual know or ascertain that that they're doing God's will? How do you know? You just have a feeling? Is it based like, God just told me to do this and I know it?
You can't do that on your own. You need some friends. Mm-hmm. You need a family. And the original insight was, back in 1935, they gathered together these 19 businessmen. This is the beginning. Mm-hmm. And this is up in the Northwest in Seattle, which at the time was being referred to as the Soviet of Washington. It was a very liberal government. Yeah. And they said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to pray amongst ourselves, and God will reveal to us one man who we can then support in a campaign. It was a guy named Arthur Langley. He became, I believe, the longest-serving governor of Washington. And Arthur Langley is this young lawyer, and he stands up and he says, I think God told me. And it works this sort of thing. Well, everybody says, yeah, I think God told you too. So then these 19 businessmen, who are sort of the leaders of the city leaders, put their muscle behind Langley, and indeed were able to make a very successful political career for him. On this basis, the group moves to the other Washington, D.C., in 1942, and they start looking into what they call prayer cells. And this language, cell, that we sort of associate now with terrorists and so on, is this language that dates way back to this really unusual sort of revolution in conservative Christian thinking at that time. They weren't the only group doing this. There's another group called Moral Rearmament, which exists to this day as well.
Moral Rearmament?
Moral rearmament, which is all over the map politically, but the founder, Frank Buckman, was pretty plain-spoken in saying he liked Hitler a lot. He thought Hitler was the model of the Christian leader. Hitler did not like him. In fact, Hitler banned his group from Germany because, as it turned out after the war, and moral rearmament would use this as proof to say, look, we're okay. Hitler said, we don't like this group because it's competition. It wasn't really competition. But so all these groups are talking about, let's get together in prayer cells where, in other words, instead of, Will, you and I, maybe we're going to go to, if we were both Christians, we're going to go to a church together, and I don't know you, and I don't know what your class background is, I don't know any of this stuff, but we're going to pray together, and we're going to approach God together. Their idea is that you can't really do that. You can only approach God with people of more or less equal power. So for the powerful need support from other powerful men. And this is what they call humility. This is their version of humility. What Sam Brownback said, he described as safe space for congressmen, which is kind of
he called it what?
Safe space, which is a term from domestic violence councils. Yeah. They try to create safe space for women who've been abused. Sam Brownback, straight white male member of the U.S. Senate, feels he needs safe space. And they get together and collectively, they say we're going to hold each other accountable. The group will never tell you how to vote on an issue. They would never do that. They're not that kind of political. They're both Republican and Democrat, always majority Republican, but always some Democrats as well. And just talking together, you'll talk about what God wants. You might talk about, for instance, what does the Bible say about war? And they'll usually conclude that, in fact, the Bible says there's lots of war. War is not necessarily a problem. And it sort of leads them into this conservative direction. And it also tends to lead them in an economic direction, which makes them very unusual in terms of the spectrum of American religious politics. Mm-hmm. They are interested in what they call biblical capitalism. They think capitalism is an economic system foretold in the Bible. And you can turn to the Bible for advice on this, but it's never very close reading. You know, I spent a lot of time with them. I'm a big Bible reader. This is what I do. I love this. And it would always be a little frustrating. I'd feel like the geeky kid in class, mm-hmm. the leader would be asking a question. I'd be raising my hand because no one else would raise their hand. They don't read it. Many of the men, in fact, carry around a Bible that is the New Testament, Psalms, mm-hmm. and Proverbs, and that's it. You know, we don't really need to dig into that other complicated stuff.
Tell me a little bit more about biblical capitalism. I'm a, Cato Institute research fellow. I like capitalism, but I'm not a huge fan of the Bible, and and so I'm interested in what they think the Bible says about it, because my sense is, and I know a lot of social conservatives who feel this way, is that that free market capitalism is a kind of It tends to break down traditional social norms and traditional communities, and I think that's right. I think it does. But then if I was a very sort of conservative, traditionalist kind of Christian, I would be quite opposed to capitalism, I think. So why do they think it's such a good thing?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad I'm talking to a guy from the Cato Institute who is going to be attuned to sort of the nuances here of what they're calling the free market. I mean, you and I both know that free market is this big umbrella term that encompasses all sorts of approaches to economics. Mm-hmm. So there is a sort of free market fundamentalism that they originate. They don't like the New Deal, mm-hmm. And they might be in line with the libertarians there because mm-hmm. they're opposed to all those kinds of. They're not dead set against them. It's just that's not the way it goes. They think that the way change happens is God moves, say, a businessman's heart. There's a guy named Dennis Bakke, mm-hmm. Who's was the head of a corporation called AES, one of the big energy corporations. And he was he is a member of the family. And so God would move his heart, for instance, and this would be an example of their kind of biblical capitalism, their kind of free market. Dennis Bakke meets a guy named Niskanen at a prayer breakfast, mm-hmm. national prayer breakfast in the mid-'90s. Museveni is the dictator of Uganda. And talking about things there, they decide that what Uganda needs is a big hydroelectric dam. And so AES gets it through a no-bid contract. And they build this huge mess of a project that just costs this poor nation a lot of money. It doesn't work. It's a big disaster. The son of the organizer of the National Prayer Breakfast is dispatched by AES to kind of take care of things. This guy whose name is, I kid you not, Christian Wright. And Christian Wright is accused of doling out $400,000 in bribes. There's no convictions, of course, and who knows what happens. It's just an accusation. And that's how this is working. This is biblical capitalism, is friends helping friends. Yeah.
Well, so what it really seems like, because when I was reading your book, I mean, and that story was quite salient, is that it seems like it seems like a network that's there to encourage a kind of self-dealing. That people are sort of attracted to it as a way of gaining connections, gaining access to power. One of the points of having political power is that you can game the system to benefit your sort of coterie of friends and followers. That strikes me as kind of the opposite of what I think of free markets. It's a way of using the sort of the violence of the political process to rig the game in favor of people who are well placed, and that's not supposed to be the idea, but that struck me as what was actually going on. Would that be an inaccurate characterization?
Yeah, that's exactly what's going on. I think one of the most egregious examples was the family support for Suharto, the late dictator of Indonesia, and I read about this in the book. They identified Suharto early on as God's chosen man for Indonesia. Suharto was a Muslim.
So how do they do that identification? That's still something that baffles me. How do you know it's Suharto?
Suharto got started. He was a top general, and he led an anti-communist slaughter in Indonesia, and started. They identified him after he'd gotten started, maybe killed 100,000 people or so. And that was the point at which they said, hey, this is our kind of guy. They started arranging junkets.
So anti-communism is next to godliness.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Anti-communism is godliness.
Mm-hmm.
This is really a Cold War religion.
Yeah.
It's reinventing itself now because, of course, there's not a Cold War. But at the time, they see great alliances with Islam against communism, and they can help Suharto. And one of the ways they can help Suharto is by the congressmen who they're sending over to meet with him and pray with him and to pray to Jesus with this Muslim leader who I think gets it. He understands, yeah, sure, I'll tell these guys I like Jesus and keep the weapons flowing.
Right.
Suharto ends up killing anywhere, people debate, is it 600,000 or is it 1.8 million? He kills a lot of people. He also does a lot of business in oil. He builds one of the big oil companies in the world, which operates essentially as a family, his family, the Suharto family ATM machine. Mm-hmm. And so this family, the Christian family that I write about, starts sending oil executives over to talk to him. I found one memo, this is to Nixon, this is some time ago in the early 70s, where Senator Mark Hatfield talks about an oilman that they've sent to pray with Suharto, and this oilman comes back just burbling and saying it was the most spiritual hour I ever spent in my life. And it was also probably the most lucrative hour he ever spent in his life. And that kind of stuff.
How can you tell the difference, right?
Right, God rewards the faithful. And that kind of thing still goes on. I mean, they're still doing that today. One example that I talk about briefly in the book is something called the Silk Road Act. Two of the real movers on that were Senator Sam Brownback and Representative Joe Pitts, both inner circle members of the family. And, as Brownback explained it to me, this the idea of this act, which is putting aid to the Central Asian republics, U.S. aid to the Central Asian republics, which are pretty corrupt regimes, is, well, we want to discourage radical Islam there. Well, if at this point in time you haven't figured out that the best way to foster radical Islam is to impose a dictatorial regime, a Saudi-style or a Hosni Mubarak Egyptian-style dictatorial regime, that's going to create radical Islam and rebellion. But It doesn't matter. The other side benefit of the Silk Road Act was a big windfall for a group called Koch Industries, which happens to be the chief financial backer of Sam Brownback's career and of much on the right. And you'll forgive me, I think Cato Institute has some Koch money as well.
David Koch is on our board of directors.
Oh, dear. Well, all right. We can maybe edit this part out or something.
There's no editing. Yeah.
There's no editing. All right. Charge ahead. And, look, I'll say this for Sam Brownback and the Koch folks, as he calls them, and the Central Asian dictators. I think the Central Asian dictators are cynical. I'm not sure if the rest of them are. I think they have so conflated their interests with their financial interests, with American national interests, with God's interests, that they actually believe that they're doing God's work. It's not, I think a lot of people say, well, isn't this just some kind of old boys network and just some kind of cynical veneer? I've been writing about religion for a long time, and I think one of the insights that I have because of that is to understand that a lot of bad stuff goes on in God's name. It doesn't mean that the people doing it don't believe in God. And that's the case there, and I think that's how that works. And as I think you'd agree, that's about the furthest thing from a free market we can imagine. But they see it as a free market because it's not government regulation.
Right. Well, I mean, other than the fact that you're using all of the representatives of the government to try to rig deals in your favor. I mean, I don't see what that really has to do with the market per se. I mean, you want the government to be a kind of a neutral, you want it to be an umpire that sets down rules of the game that people adhere to that allow for the development and flourishing of markets and exchange, but you want it to be kind of a neutral observer rather than an active participant who's always like giving favors to this group, pulling strings with dictators in other countries in order to get people no-bid contracts and so on and so forth.
Well, you don't want it to be that if you believe that God has chosen America for a special destiny.
Yeah.
As they do. And, they've long felt that they're not that kind of xenophobic nationalist.
Yeah.
In fact, they're very internationalist, but they do believe that America they believe America was founded as a Christian nation, which is a pretty ahistorical reading of founding, and it has a special mission to carry the gospel to the world, and that therefore it's legitimate to use government agencies to do that. They certainly use the Pentagon to do that.
Well, but that's the point then of like seeing, Hitler and Mao and Lenin or Stalin or whoever as your paragons of success, right? You just use any means at your disposal for advancing your ends, right?
Yeah, exactly. Although, the odd thing is that when they talk about Hitler, Lenin, Mao, they'll say what these guys understood was they understood the strength of a covenant. These guys would get together with 2 or 3 friends throughout their documents and their archives. Is constantly this refrain of Hitler. Look what a few guys getting together in the back of a Bavarian beer hall were able to do. Or Doug Coe will say, look at Hitler and Goebbels, and 1 or 2 other guys. They had a plan, and they were able to do this because they were loyal to one another. They were a brotherhood. The most obscene thing about this is loyalty was the last thing on Hitler's
about
list.
Steve Jobs and Wozniak or something like that. Look what these 2 ragamuffin dropouts were able to accomplish.
Right. Yeah, there's other examples, and there's other examples where, in fact, the people in question didn't actually end up killing all their friends, as
right.
Hitler and Stalin were famous for doing. We're purging their brotherhood. These guys were not loyal to their friends. The 2 or 3 who started with Hitler in the back of the Bavarian beer hall, they were all dead by 1936.
Right.
But I mean, beyond the absolute grotesquerie of using Hitler, Stalin, or Mao as a positive example of anything, it's just really sort of astonishing. It's a defender of the group, David Kuo, who's an interesting and smart and decent guy, but he'll defend them. He was sort of running faith-based initiatives for Bush in the first administration, and then ended up actually turning against Bush. He says, well, this is just a metaphor. To me, this is very cold comfort. Your metaphor, as you say, you can't think of a better metaphor than Hitler. And what is the metaphor? It's a metaphor for totalitarianism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's just baffling.
Yeah. It is baffling. There's a sense in which you almost think that the group is tone deaf.
Jeff, you say that because you say that it's not a veneer, a cynical veneer, but it seems difficult to recognize. And let's talk a little bit more about the psychology of this kind of network or this kind of movement, because I said I wanted to come back to the idea of God just use me kind of language. So there's this rhetoric of passivity and submission, but I mean it seems quite obvious as you read your story and you see the kinds of things that the political and corporate players involved are doing, that it really does seem like they're using passivity as a cover for a kind of abnegation of responsibility for their, in fact, incredibly driven, active ambition. But now you might be right that they're sincere in believing that they're doing God's will, but that just seems to, it really raises the question of to what extent can people be sincerely self-deluded for self-aggrandizing purposes.
I think that is exactly the problem. And there's sort of two Christian traditions here. There's the tradition which speaks truth to power, and then there's this lesser sort of tradition that they're a part of that gives cover to power. And I feel that when you have these very, very powerful men getting together and talking about how they're humble and they don't do anything, God does it all for them.
Right.
A rich man who says, "Hey, I didn't do anything. God did it all." No, man, you made that money for better or worse, and you should be responsible for it and say, "This is how I did it." And if you did it honestly, great. And if you didn't do it honestly, then we need to hold you accountable. They're not interested in those distinctions because it's the very sincerity of their belief in this absolutely all-power, everyday interventionist God. I mean, when they talk about the decisions that you should turn over to God, very literally, for instance, in the men's groups that I spent time with them, you would talk about very intimate decisions in your life, who you're going to marry. When you become a member of the group, and some of their documents say, you find a prayer cell, and then you give veto power over your life to the other men in this group. And I saw this happen with the man who got me involved in the group. really ugly sort of personal psychology story. This guy, the woman that he was involved with, who was elsewhere, had a very bad experience, been violently attacked, and naturally he wants to leave and go to her, of course, right?
Right.
And their reaction was, well, what was she doing in the bar? And maybe she brought this on herself. Well, that's ugly enough. We've heard that kind of thing. But in this group, that's not just them being critical. They actually, if he's to stay in the group and stay in good standing, they have veto power. They can say, avoid that woman from now on, and you will. And that's really sort of goes even beyond that kind of, I'm using this as a cover for enriching myself. And doing so in a non-accountable way, and maybe even a dishonest way, that goes into this really kind of totalitarian psychology. Yeah,
well, I think that helps explain the psychology of it as well, because you can have a kind of it sounds like a certain kind of there's a kind of circular egoism going on here, in the sense that I'm going to turn over my personal decisions to my brothers. Yeah. So I can't claim, I can be honest with myself when I'm saying that, look, this is not my decision, this is not my choice, this is what my brothers have decided is best for me in consultation with Christ.
Exactly.
But then when they ask you what they should do, then you kind of act as their self-interested proxy in a certain kind of way, and you and your other friends, you get together and decide what would really be best for Bob. And you tell Bob that God commands him to do the thing that would really be his sort of narrow self-interest, where he to decide it for himself, and then he can sort of deny that he's really responsible, or he chose it because his brothers chose it for him. And so it allows everybody to be sort of like maximizing their narrow self-interest in a way that gives them plausible deniability of their own motivations.
Exactly. I think self-interest proxy is a really good way of putting it. One story I tell in the book is about how the family converted a man named Chuck Colson, who today is one of the really leading figures of the Christian right. It's sometimes called the house intellectual of the Christian right, and he is a smart guy. Some may remember him as one of Nixon's dirty tricksters, as the guy who famously promised to he'd run over his grandmother with a truck if it would help get Nixon elected. He was one of the Watergate felons, ends up serving prison time. Real rough guy. Well, he's out of office. He's waiting to see what's going to happen to him. And Tom Phillips, who's then the CEO of Raytheon, the defense contractor, reaches out to him and says, I'd like to talk to you about your spiritual condition. And Phillips then develops this correspondence with Colson and then shares it with Doug Coe, the leader of the family. And Doug Coe shows up in Colson's office one day and says, are you ready to submit to Christ? And Colson famously writes a best-selling memoir called Born Again. He does so, and as he writes in Born Again, he says, thereafter I discovered a veritable underground of Christ's men in government all through Washington. And veritable underground, this is his phrase. And what that meant was that the day after word got around that he had been praying with Coe, he starts getting calls from people who didn't want to touch Colson with a 10-foot pole. Not just Republicans who didn't want to be tainted by him, but Democrats. Conservative Democrats who suddenly said, now you're brother, and we're going to help you out. And chief among those was a guy named Harold Hughes, senator from Iowa. Pretty liberal Democrat, not the brightest bulb on the porch. The first draft of his memoirs are in the family's archives, and someone convinced him to take out the part about ESP, various encounters with space aliens. Not a bright guy, but a good-hearted guy. And he gets down on his knees and he prays with Chuck Colson. He says, from here on out, I'm at your side. And indeed he was. He broke ranks with the Democratic Party to defend Colson on the floor of the Senate. Colson ends up only going to prison for 7 months. And then Harold Hughes and a couple other congressmen and Doug Coe write letters to the parole board, and they said, let him out. We need this guy to do youth work and so on. And Colson gets out and builds one of the biggest Christian right organizations in the world called Prison Fellowship, which seems like a good group, but then again you see that almost that sort of proxy self-interest. Colson's job back in the Nixon days was in getting folks who wouldn't normally vote for someone like Nixon, blue-collar guys, that kind of folks, to vote for Nixon. These days, his job is depoliticizing the largest prison population, I believe, in the history of the world. I think America's prison population is.
Yeah.
And he's very explicit about this. He says this is a potentially radical class. Here's millions of people who are disenfranchised, who don't think the system works for them. And he says, what I need to do is make them take personal responsibility. Personal responsibility is a good thing. But he goes a little further and convinces them that their problems are entirely their own, of sin. And they become a fragmented, sort of depoliticized folk. And at the same time, Coulson keeps selling best-selling books doing this. And God keeps telling him this is what he wants him to do. It's exactly what you say, self-interest by proxy. Coulson then functions that same way for Sam Brownback, advising Sam Brownback that the Silk Road Act is what God wants him to do in order to fight radical Islam in Central Asian republics. And by the way, this might bring in some more campaign donations for you, but you didn't ask for them, and you never would ask for them,
right.
So you can't be blamed for it.
So yeah, the thing that baffles, and I think you're probably more sort of tolerant of this stuff than I am. You're a documentarian of kind of American religion, and so. And I don't imagine you'd do that unless you had kind of a soft spot for the motivations that bring people to religion. But I'm kind of closer to the sort of Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens sense of incredulity at the stupidity of religious belief in general. But this particular set of beliefs, which seems to me so transparently moronic and so transparently self-serving. How is it? I mean, I just don't is it just the social psychology of having a group of people who all agree to it that allows really intelligent, successful people to really buy into something that should be a complete embarrassment to any person of, a certain level of intellectual cultivation?
I have a soft spot for what brings people to this, definitely, and I understand that. I don't have a soft spot for the family at all. I think, I think sometimes the question, people ask, what does fundamentalism want? And I think the better question to ask is, what have they already done? And I feel the damage that just this one elite fundamentalist group alone has managed to do to American democracy. I think about the country I live in and the country that it could be had this group not been there for 70 years. And it's horrifying to me and tragic and terribly sad. And I think, but it is essential to me to understand that so many of these people do this with good intentions, and that doesn't excuse them at all. But I want to know why they're doing that. And they do this with good intentions. You see this, for instance, another congressman I spoke with is Frank Wolf, a Republican from Northern Virginia, who's very involved with the group and has a reputation for being a Republican involved with human rights, international human rights. And that is a guy who has witnessed real suffering and cares about it and really wants to do something about it. But because I think here's where the sort of ideology matters, because they have succumbed to the sort of evangelical faith, which encourages them always to look at the level of the individual heart. They're not able to make a systemic critique. And they're not able to realize that some of the things they're doing are going to cause problems on a bigger scale. I think about one of the projects that a lot of conservative evangelicals who get the label of compassion conservative have been involved with, which is fighting human trafficking. Of course, you want to fight human trafficking. One of the ways that they did that is by changing the laws so that groups that get federal money to fight, say, child prostitution in Thailand or something like this, cannot in any way endorse prostitution. And you're endorsing prostitution, for instance, if you distribute condoms.
Right.
So a 12-year-old kid in Thailand, better that she get AIDS and go to her death with her soul intact than that she sully herself with sin. Now, the person who did that, boy, they really wanted to help that girl, and they more or less murdered her. I think that sort of explains a lot of the social psychology. It does have to do with, I don't see this as a left-right issue, but I do see it as in the tradition of a sort of an American resistance to recognizing the power of ideology and culture in American life, to thinking systemically. And this is certainly as much of a problem for liberals as it is for conservatives. So I think that's where these people are coming from and getting involved in things. I think of what they, some of their projects. Well, one project that I write a lot about in the book, because it became the sort of the beta version of what later became compassionate conservatism, was that they were very worried about black powers back in the 60s and 70s, and they were worried about the Black Panthers. So they created a group in Washington called the Black Buffers. Naming's not their strong point, and their idea was that if they could get various African American ex-cons out on the street, and they would intervene at any sort of sign of radicalism, and they would help start black businesses, and that there would be this sort of uplift ideology, and that then they didn't really need to address any kind of institutional racism. They didn't need to think about those things. That it would all happen through changed hearts, which is such a heartwarming story, except that oftentimes it just ends in absolute disaster.
Right.
And then when you combine that with their really ready willingness to dehumanize massive groups of people throughout the Cold War, and communists, or if you were, it doesn't matter if you were a peasant, doesn't matter if you were a 2-month-old baby, you're a communist baby, you're not really entitled to life at that point. And I think now you see that in the sort of the exercise of, I think they're enamored of a model of American power, which a lot of us, conservatives and liberals, would be very distressed with, which is the sort of the imperial model. And I think, that's what they talk about. They talk about Washington as a capital of this sort of worldwide Christian order. And one of the things that separates them from populist fundamentalists, we've all heard about the Tim LaHaye's, the Left Behinds, the folks who talk about the rapture. These guys don't believe in the rapture. They are part of an older movement called postmillennialism. Premillennialism is a rapture. The idea is that Christ is going to come back and rule over the world for 1,000 years. The family believes, in the inner circle, that what happens is Christ won't come back unless they can establish 1,000 years of godly rule. So this is a long-term project and much, much more political.
Yeah. Well, that's just completely terrifying. See, I'll confess to you, Jeff, when I started your book, I was kind of expecting a little bit of a just judging from the PR materials. I was expecting a little more of a something of a politically motivated hatchet job on a certain kind of social conservative. But then when I actually read the book, it turned out that I'm completely scandalized it does sound like a sort of like shadowy conspiracy, but I bought the fact that it is an actually existing network of people who use the network to offer and hoard opportunities for themselves for their political and economic gain. But the thing that scandalizes me at a certain level, but what really scandalizes me is, like you say, it's not really a right versus left sort of issue. It really does strike me as a kind of rationality versus irrationality kind of issue, or a civilization versus a kind of mysticism kind of issue. That what you've got is an ideology that's really, and this is what I think has always bothered me, especially about evangelical Christianity, is that it's just so gut-based that there is very, very little constraint on anything, as long as you can get enough people to agree that they really feel that God wants this, and how they're supposed to know that God wants that. It's that they feel it, and if enough people feel it, it's got to be right. And there's really no arguing with that. How do you argue with that? A bunch of people just completely convinced at a very serious, meaningful, emotional level that they've been called into service to do this particular thing. And I find that incredibly dangerous and frightening.
Yeah, I think, in the book I talk about that gut feeling, which really goes back to Jonathan Edwards and the 18th centuries and something called the First Great Awakening, and this whole tradition of revivals in America. And this is, scholars are always wondering, why is America so much more religious than really every other nation that's as developed economically as it is? And it's because it has this big revival tradition and this very emotional tradition that goes back to the Great Awakening. And there's good things to that, Without that Great Awakening, without that kind of fiery passion, without that emotion, I don't think there would have been an American Revolution. Without that, there wouldn't have been abolition. Evangelicalism has done amazing things in American life. Without that Christian passion, there wouldn't be a Martin Luther King. There's all these sort of wonderful things. But those things, of course, always take place in the public sphere, and where we can argue about them. And if I have a soft spot in some ways for that, which I do, and you don't, Will, then, here we are, on Blogging Heads, sort of talking about it and arguing about it. And there is a way to deal with that. Someone says, well, it's just my gut. Well, then you can say, well, but let's go to constitutional authority, the rules that we all agree, to play by. And you can do that when it's in the public sphere. So, when I say it's not a left-right issue, I don't even see it as rationality or irrationality. I see it as one almost of, is your commitment to democracy or is your commitment to authority, power? It's a transparency issue. If the family was doing this in public, like, in the book I do write also about the more conventional Christian right that I think we're familiar with, Ted Haggard, the fallen megachurch pastor, and so on. Something called the Family Research Council there in Washington, sort of one of the powerful. I don't like the Family Research Council at all. I think they're a hate group. Right. I think they're atrocious. And it's easy for me to think that and to know that because all their stuff is right out there in the public. And if I don't like it when they say that, when they rail against gay people or feminists or something like that, I can argue. And in fact, I can go to them and I can say, well, what's your biblical authority on that? One sort of odd moment in the book, I have a chapter about Sam Brownback because he was very foolishly, I think, gave me a lot of access to see how he was living things. And I said, well, let's talk, he's a leading opponent of gay marriage and gay rights. And I think a lot of people saw Sam Brownback's presidential campaign, which just went nowhere, and they said, well, this guy's a nobody. Yeah. That's forgetting, of course, that he's still, in fact, kind of a powerful guy in Washington because of the caucus behind him. So I said, well, what do you... let's talk about the biblical passages that you see as forbidding homosexuality. I'm sitting here in the Religious Studies Department of New York University. I'm an associate research scholar at Center for Religion and Media, and I don't read the Bible in the original, but I've got folks across the hall who do. I've got So I went to talk to these people, and I took that back to Sam Brownback. I said, let's debate about this. And it turns out, in fact, he wasn't familiar. He didn't know actually where this came from. He said God had revealed it to him in his heart. God had sent beamed a special message to Sam Brownback's heart that says that if you allow two men to get married, you will go the way of Sweden. Yeah,
exactly.
Go the way Sweden of what? Is a special kind of hell for Christian fundamentalism.
Sweden?
Yes, Sweden. You don't know about Sweden? Terrible, terrible place.
I don't know. One of the things I do is study social indicators, and Sweden's a pretty nice place.
Well, I suppose if you're Satan.
Yeah, if you're a deracinated cosmopolitan.
Right, exactly. But even then, because he's putting it in the public, then, his irrationality is exposed. And you can do, as you just said, look, that's not a legitimate argument, and we can move on. What the problem with a group like the Family is that it's never exposed. Back in 1966, when they decided that they were going to go sort of literally underground, that was the term they used, they said, we are going to submerge our public appearance. Because from now on, when we do business, you do business on your own letterhead. Your congressman so-and-so. We're not using letterhead anymore. We will deny to the world that we exist. We will not use the word Christian. That's what you really can't argue with. You can argue with irrationality. You can say, you know what, that doesn't hold water. Let's take a vote. We all think, that's a nutty idea. You can't argue with behind the scenes.
Yeah. Well, I guess you've done quite a service then in and writing a book about them, sort of bringing it out into public view. Some of your book, you mentioned a little bit in our conversation this distinction between kind of populist and elitist fundamentalist views, and you see them as kind of merging. As we're sort of like finishing up here, can you say something about what you've learned about what you think the direction of fundamentalist Christianity is in the United States and what that portends, perhaps, politically?
Yeah, I think now is just one of the most interesting moments probably in the last century for looking at religion and politics. This being actually easily the most religious campaign ever, and that was before Jeremiah Wright. And on the Democratic side, both of them competing to say I'm the more religious one. In the book, one of the things that I realized, why hasn't there been much writing about the family before? There's been a little bit. As I said, the LA Times had written about it. Back in the 70s, Playboy did an expose. New Republic did one in the 60s, but people really noticed it because we're conditioned to seeing fundamentalism in these populist terms. Guys like Ted Haggard, who I write about. And in fact, a lot of those guys' ideas they start in this trickle-down way up with these elites, this elite fundamentalism. And so you have to think of it going back to 1925, and the Scopes monkey trial, the evolution trial, which is a terrible defeat for conservative Christianity in America. And the movement sort of split. And one group, the populists, decided, well, we're going to build Bible colleges and parachurch ministries. And this other group, this elite movement, says we're going to get together in private off-the-record cells and we're going to go direct to government. We're not going to stand on the outside of the gate and pound. We're going to be inside. So you have this sort of popular and elite movement, and they're going along on parallel tracks. And for the Cold War, the elite movement doesn't really show up because they hate, above all, communism, and so does American government. So they're kind of on an even track. The populist movement, meanwhile, starts banging on the door in the late 70s, right? Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority and all these kinds of characters. That group rises and falls. And something that the American media does is about every 5 years they declare whatever current manifestation of the Christian right there is, they declare that dead, and that we are all just a very progressive country, advanced and intellectually and so on, and that's all in the past. They've been doing that every 5 years since 1925. So, this is one of those moments where the press is, again, doing that. And I think a lot of people are tempted to say, well, it's probably going to be a Democrat, so that must be the end of that. Well, this group's been around since 1935. They've been through Democrats and Republicans. They endure. And I think what's going to happen now, I saw populist and elite converging, and I think you see that because you start seeing megachurches talking about economics as a Christian issue. That's something really new. These ideas that are elite ideas are moving into the sort of lifestyle Christianity of the megachurches. Yeah. The old war chiefs like Falwell and Robertson, they're gone. There's a new generation that I think is much more in line with the elite approach, which is not about banging a pulpit. It's not about being rude or anything like this. It's about slowly sort of constraining the definition of what democracy is, slowly constraining the definition of what normal is, so that you can't even really have an argument because your terms are so narrowly defined.
Who would you say some of those figures are?
I will probably offend some people. One of the things, I think Rick Warren, author of the popular Purpose-Driven Life, widely considered apolitical, although he sends out campaign email blasts in 2004 reminding everybody that the key issues were same-sex marriage, stem cell. He's a political guy. He doesn't come off like that. You even see someone like Joel Osteen, who's a huge bestseller, doesn't talk about politics. He talks about how to improve your life. Of course, there are politics there. Yeah. This is a guy who is advocating a certain kind of economic approach to organizing society, and is very, very influential at doing it. He's a populist fundamentalist, but in some ways he's talking about the same things that the elite fundamentalists do. And I think that as we get, even if we get into a Democratic administration, I think those things are going to endure and be popular, and we're going to see a slow build-up to another sort of crescendo, another revival. This is how it goes, this sort of revival schedule. And I think the press is going to be startled and say, where did this come from? We thought this was all gone. And they're going to call it old-time religion. It's not old-time religion. It's the religion of right now. And I think that movement is expanding even as the old Christian right is shrinking.
One thing that I've always been completely fascinated by, and I've sort of often wish I had more time to study, was the idea that, and I think you see this in your Rick Warrens and Joel Osteen's, the idea that because I mean what you're saying is sort of that these guys are going to sort of guide public opinion in a way that's going to have a shaping effect on the nature of American public life. But in some sense, I feel like the doctrine that they're preaching is being shaped. The more economically focused doctrine that they're preaching is being actually shaped by the economic forces themselves. I'm a little bit more of a Marxist in this sense, where I think that the ideology is in fact influenced by the sort of economic superstructure, that if you're trying to have a populist religion that fills giant megachurches, but you aren't preaching a message that is going to in fact pay off for people, you're not going to be popular. So there's a kind of selection process by which the most popular churches are the ones who end up preaching a kind of creed of success that is really kind of wrung dry of actual Christian content. And that's what I think I'm seeing is something that's, I mean, they're using all these sort of just kind of brazen emotive tools about salvation and stuff, but the content of it just seems to be about, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, get things done, here's how to get a promotion, here's how to get a raise. And those don't seem like the worst things in the world. And so what extent do you think that those guys are being driven by the demand for religious doctrine and the extent to which religious doctrine is driving shifts in public opinion? Which way do you think it goes?
I think that's a good insight. Although I think you're very optimistic. There's a conservative sociologist named Rodney Stark who has a sort of market theory of churches, which I write a little bit about in the book, and I don't think anyone who's spent a lot of time in churches in America would think that theory holds up. Yeah. And the reality is that, I think I spent a lot of time at New Life Church, Ted Haggard's New Life Church, which in fact doesn't. It's not working according to the market. It's preaching a free market gospel that is a version of the free market that doesn't make sense for a lot of these people. Yeah. So if you have people who are going to church and tithing so that they can get their pastor access to George Bush so that he can tell George Bush about how the Bible teaches us that we shouldn't have steel tariffs, no matter how you cut it, that's not doing much for the folks in Colorado Springs. Or, for instance...
it's bringing down the price of steel.
I suppose so. Bringing down the price of steel, and now you can build new shopping malls, as they are. New Life is also, among other things, kind of a real estate entity. And it's this massive mega church on a plain north of Colorado Springs, and they have this incredible plan for this all-time great shopping plaza to go around it, in part because cities are dangerous. Colorado Springs is allegedly a very dangerous place, and you don't want to go there, so you want to be able to drive wherever you go. This is not necessarily good for your local economy, and it's probably not good for your soul to spend that much time in your car. But then you see the application of these ideas overseas, and you suddenly realize that this kind of banal blandness here that's going on here, and it's harmless enough, it comes at a cost overseas. Rick Warren is a good example. A little while ago, with U.S. government help, he's instituted this project to make Rwanda the world's first officially purpose-driven nation.
Rwanda.
And the idea that what Rwanda most needs is for people to study Rick Warren's book, through help from U.S. government faith-based initiatives, to discover that as a Rwandan or as a human being, they on their own are nothing. They're nobody and they're worthless. Their only purpose is God's purpose.
Disgusting.
I don't think anyone was looking at Rwanda and said, boy, the problem that country has is they have too much self-esteem.
Yeah, and not enough Rick Warren.
Not enough Rick Warren. And the other thing that he's doing is Rick Warren is saying, okay, here's how you're going to get past genocide. We're going to do a massive small business program. Mm-hmm. And, this is so naive. This is so naive, no matter whether you're libertarian or socialist or whatever, evangelical. Even Christianity Today, the flagship evangelical magazine, said, you know what, Rwanda has bigger problems right now. This is not, maybe small business is fine. The idea that this is the end-all solution, that's terrible. So that's the sort of the naive, benign version. And I think the very negative version is that this kind of market-driven ideology, you see support for, that's really intimately linked to the support for dictators around the world. What we call a free market in America, which is not always a free market, right, is oftentimes subsidized by dictatorial regimes, say in the Central Asian republics. Or you have Ukraine is a country where evangelicals have become very powerful. The biggest megachurch in Europe is in Ukraine. And James Dobson, by the way, claims credit for the Orange Revolution, which happened a few years ago. And the Orange Revolution is mostly a good thing, and no one could understand why these Eastern Ukrainians were opposed to it. They were miners, and one of the things they didn't like about the new government was it was going to strip the mines of safety regulations. That goes beyond libertarian free market issues into these are guys who are trying to protect their lives, and they're being told that they can't have a law that says, the mine is required to have sturdy beams or something like that, because that would be interfering with God's free market.
It just strikes me as very weird that you think that you just think that God was telling you something about what safety regulations ought to be, or what or what Social Security system ought to be. It seems
what could be more arrogant than that? That's the thing. They talk about humility. That is the most un-Christian thing possibly. That I'm going to sit here and I'm going to say, well, let me tell you, I was just talking with Jesus. He wasn't talking to me, by the way, not you. And I've got a special message. And, Will, I think God has told me that the Cato Institute needs to, suddenly team up with the Service Employees International Union. And, you guys don't want to do that. That's not what you believe. Right. And where am I to say that God has given me a special message for you,
Well, I have a special message, Jeff, which is that we're out of time. But thanks so much for coming on. As a fascinating book, just wonderfully written, and a pleasure to read. The book is The Family, The Secret Fundamentalism at the Heart of American Power. Thanks so much for coming on, Jeff.
Thank you.
Take care.